will keep beating, even though it's not being stimulated by any nerves, okay? And that's because the heart has its own pacemaker, which is called the SA node, okay? So what I want you to do, take a look at these lungs. Now, these lungs are inflating and deflating during inspiration and expiration. Could you do the same thing with lungs? Could you cut the lungs out of the body of an animal, set it on a table, would those lungs still be able to inflate? What do you think? They would? Okay. Well, do lungs have any motor innervation? No, they don't. So what does cause the lungs to inflate like this? There has to be something that triggers those volume changes in the lungs, right? What is that? I know you're all probably thinking the same thing because I know you know this. This isn't a hard question, okay? So what's the part of the brain that controls breathing? Or where are the respiratory centers located in the brain? They're in a part of the brainstem, right? Right? And that sends signals out to what? Where do those signals that are produced by the respiratory center go to cause, let's say, inspiration? One of the sets of intercostal, the external intercostals, and there's one other muscle. What's the other one that causes quiet inspiration? Diaphragm, right. Those are skeletal muscles, okay? So it's contraction of skeletal muscles that cause volume changes, that cause pressure changes inside the lungs, that causes the lungs to inflate. It's also pressure changes during expiration that causes the air to leave the lungs and the lungs deflate. So can you cut the lungs out of the body and still have them inflate? No, you can't, because you need contraction of those inspiratory muscles in order to expand the thoracic cavity. But you can cut the heart out and set the heart on a table, and it will keep beating, because the heart does not need any stimulation by nerves. You can cut all of the autonomic nerves that lead to the heart. The heart will still keep beating because it has that SA node. Okay. Lungs are different though. Lungs do not receive, the only motor innervation the lungs receive are to the smooth muscles that are in the small bronchi and the bronchioles. That causes bronchoconstriction, okay, or bronchodilation. But the lungs do not receive any motor innervation itself that causes them to inflate. That's caused by contraction of voluntary muscles. Okay, that was just a little bit of a review. All right, so during gas exchange, oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse between the air in the alveoli and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries in the lungs. That's called external respiration. There's also gas exchange that occurs between the systemic capillaries in almost all of the body and the cells throughout the body. And that's called internal respiration. And the diffusion of oxygen and CO2 occur in those same places, but oxygen and CO2 are moving in opposite directions. Because oxygen is a molecule that cells need for aerobic respiration, but CO2 is a waste product that our body needs to get rid of. So CO2 moves out of cells into the blood, and that blood carries it to the lungs for removal, whereas oxygen is going the opposite direction. Now, we have another, one of the gas laws that applies to gas exchange. And this is called Dalton's Law of Partial Pressures. And this is a really, really important gas law, okay? Because this determines whether or not a gas is going to diffuse in or out of the blood. So what Dalton's law states is that the total pressure of air is equal to the partial pressure of each individual gas. Now, the partial pressure is the pressure exerted by just one type of gas molecule, okay? And so the total air pressure, air is actually a mixture of gases. Air doesn't just contain oxygen, it contains quite a few different gases. The total pressure of air, which at sea level is 760 millimeters mercury, can be calculated by adding the partial pressures of each of the individual gases. So the most common gases in air include nitrogen. Nitrogen is actually the most abundant gas in air, makes up approximately 78% of all the air molecules. Then oxygen, water vapor, and carbon dioxide. Those are the four most common gas molecules found in air. Now, you can calculate the partial pressure of each one of those individual gases, and if you do that and add them all up, it should add up to 760 millimeters if you assume we're at sea level. If you're at a higher altitude, the total pressure of air is going to be a little bit less, and so the partial pressure of each one of the gases is going to be a little bit lower. So the way you calculate the partial pressure is you first have to know what the percentage of that gas is in air. So oxygen, for example, makes up 20.9% of air, almost 21% of air. So oxygen only makes up about 1/5 of all air molecules. So the way you calculate partial pressure is you first convert the percentage of that gas to decimal form. So when you convert a number to a percentage, you have to multiply that number by 100. So to convert from percentage to decimal form, you have to divide that by 100. So division by 100 is really easy. All you have to do is move the decimal point 2 places to the left. Okay? So if we convert that to decimal form, would be 0.209. So to calculate the partial pressure, you just multiply 0.209 times the total air pressure at sea level. Okay, if you want to find the partial pressure at sea level. So if you multiply 760 by 0.209, you get 159 millimeters mercury. So that's the partial pressure of oxygen. So physiologists use the partial pressure of a gas kind of like as a concentration. It's not really a concentration, but you can think of it as sort of like the concentration of a gas. And it's important to know the concentration of a gas because that determines whether or not it's going to diffuse from one area to another. Because gases always diffuse in the same direction as any compound. It diffuses from an area higher concentration to lower concentration. So to know whether or not oxygen is going to diffuse from the air in the alveoli into the pulmonary blood, you need to know the concentrations of both the pulmonary blood as well as the oxygen in the alveoli. Okay? As long as the concentration is higher in the alveoli than the blood, then oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood. Okay? So the mechanism of gas exchange is, it couldn't be any simpler. The mechanism is just simple diffusion. It just diffuses down its concentration gradient. And that's how gas exchange occurs. Okay? Okay, so given that the partial pressure of oxygen is 159, let's try to calculate the partial pressure of another molecule. Okay? Let's try to determine the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Okay? So that's actually in a question here. So let's, let me adjust this here so we can see them. Okay. So the percentage of carbon dioxide in the air is very, very low actually. But although even though it isn't low, it's been increasing year after year after year for probably the last 40 or 50 years. And that's really undisputed because meteorologists are measuring the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. They monitor that all the time in many, many dozens of different places all over the world. So if the partial pressure of CO2 is, or if the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is 0.04 and the total atmospheric pressure is 760, what would be the partial pressure of carbon dioxide? Okay, I want you to figure that, I want you to do that calculation. So remember, to do that, you need to convert 0.04 to decimal form. So you need to divide 0.04 by 100, and then multiply that times 760. So I'd like you to do that with a calculator. Unless you're better at math than I am. I can't do that in my head. I need to use a calculator. I can divide by 100, but I can't do the multiplication part. And then when you get your answer, why don't you select the correct one? So one of these is the correct answer. Be sure you put in an answer on this one. I don't know if I have any other questions today because most of this is pretty straightforward. Okay, it looks like 17 have answered. I count 20 here. Now there's 18. So 2 more people still need to answer. By the way, in case something happens on the device you're using, like if you can't get connected to the Wi-Fi and so can't answer a question, send me an email after class and tell me, hey, Dr. Malik, I couldn't vote because I couldn't get connected to the Wi-Fi, and I'll mark you present. So looks like everybody has answered now. So let's take a look at your all the responses. Okay. Correct answer is 0.3. Okay, so the way you calculate that, divide 0.04 by 100, so you move the decimal point 3 places to the left. So that would be equal to 0.0004, and then you just multiply 0.0004 times 760, and that should give you an answer of 0.3. So the partial pressure of CO2 in the air is only 0.3 millimeters mercury. That's a very low partial pressure, and that's because the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air is so low. Okay? So it's probably a good thing that we don't use CO2 as a final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain, because we'd have a hard time getting carbon dioxide from the air because the concentration is so low. Instead, we actually produce it as a waste product. So the fact that CO2 concentration is so low in the air, that makes it easier for the CO2 to diffuse out of the pulmonary capillaries and into the air in the alveoli. All right. So the percentage of CO2 in the air is only 0.04. So I've done the calculations for you here. So if you convert 0.04 to decimal form, that's 0.0004 times 760. That's equal to 0.3 millimeters mercury. And since a gas will diffuse from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, that allows CO2 to diffuse out of the blood and into the alveoli. So as long as the partial pressure of CO2 is higher in the blood than the alveoli, CO2 will diffuse into the alveoli. And the CO2 is always going to be higher in the blood because our cells are constantly producing CO2. Okay. All right. Now, as it turns out, the air in the alveoli actually has a lower concentration of oxygen than the atmosphere. And it has a higher concentration of CO2 in the alveoli compared to the atmosphere for several reasons. One of them is as we breathe in air, that air is humidified. It picks up water vapor from the mucous membranes that line our airways, especially in our nasal cavity. And when you add water vapor molecules to air, that decreases the proportion of all of the other gas molecules. So it lowers the concentration of oxygen and nitrogen and CO2. Okay? And so all of those gas molecules. So that's one reason. It's because when you add water vapor, that reduces the proportion of all the other types of gas molecules. Another reason is that when you exhale, there's no way that you can completely collapse all of your conducting airways. So there's always going to be some air left over from the end of the previous respiratory cycle. So that air that's left over in that anatomical dead air space, it's going to have a slightly higher concentration of CO2 and a lower concentration of oxygen. So when you breathe in, you're going to mix that fresh air with some of that old air that has remained in your lung or your respiratory system, including part of your lungs. And so that oxygen poor air is going to mix with the fresh air. That's going to lower the proportion of oxygen in your lungs, in the alveoli of your lungs. So instead of the air in your alveoli having a partial pressure of oxygen of 159, it's only going to be about 104 millimeters. Okay? So that's quite a bit less than 159. But as long as the concentration of oxygen in your lungs is higher than the concentration of oxygen in your blood, then oxygen will move across the respiratory surfaces into your pulmonary capillaries that contain the blood. So oxygen will still load into your blood in your lungs. Okay? Because the concentration of oxygen in your blood is much, much less than 104. Okay? Now, same thing happens with CO2. The CO2 has a partial pressure of 0.3 in the atmosphere, but when you breathe air in, you're going to have a higher concentration of CO2 in the air left over in your lungs, because CO2 is constantly moving out of your blood into your lungs. And so the concentration of CO2 is going to be higher in the alveoli of your lungs than it is in the atmosphere. But as long as the concentration of CO2 is higher in your blood than in your lungs, then CO2 is still going to move out of the blood and into your lungs where it can be exhaled. All right? So let's look at this. Let's look at what happens. So let's start first with external respiration. So this is the exchange of gases between your lungs and your pulmonary capillaries. So when you bring in fresh air, that air from the atmosphere, which has a partial pressure of 159, mixes with that oxygen poor air that's in your anatomical dead air space. And so when that happens, the concentration of oxygen is lowered to 104. The concentration of oxygen in your pulmonary blood is only about 40 millimeters mercury. And that's because when that blood went through our systemic circulation, it gave up most of the oxygen to our cells in our tissues and organs. And so the concentration of oxygen is quite a bit lower in our blood than it is in our lungs. So as long as the concentration in the alveoli, in our lungs, is higher than the concentration of oxygen in the blood, then oxygen is going to diffuse by diffusion from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, just like that arrow shows up here. Okay. Likewise, CO2 is going to be higher in the blood than it is in the alveoli, because that blood has picked up CO2 produced by our cells. But because the concentration of CO2 is lower in the atmosphere than it is in our lungs, the partial pressure of CO2 in the lungs, because it's going to mix with some of that old air that's left over from the previous respiratory cycle that has a real high concentration of CO2. Partial pressure in our lungs is going to be about 40. But even though the absolute partial pressures are a lot lower than those are for oxygen, there's still a gradient. So the partial pressure of CO2 is higher in the blood than in the alveoli in the lungs, and so CO2 is going to diffuse in the opposite direction, from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Okay? So again, the mechanism involved here is just diffusion. It's just diffusion. That's the only, that's what causes gas exchange. So because the gradient for oxygen is so much greater than the gradient for CO2, why isn't oxygen transported at a faster rate than CO2? You bring in just about as much oxygen as you exhale CO2. It's proportional, because for every oxygen molecule your body uses, it produces about one CO2 molecule. But if you look at the concentration difference for oxygen, it's a lot higher than the concentration difference for CO2. So one might ask the question, well, why is the gas exchange rate about the same even though the concentration gradient is so much greater for oxygen? Okay. Well, the reason for that is because there are other things besides the concentration gradient that affect diffusion. One of those is explained by another gas law called Henry's law. And Henry's law has to do with the permeability of a gas in a liquid like water. Okay? So in order for a gas molecule to diffuse across a respiratory membrane, it has to diffuse into that thin layer of water that's on the inside of the alveoli. And different gas molecules diffuse into water differently. They have different permeabilities in water. So Henry's law states that the amount of gas that dissolves in a liquid is proportional to two things. The first is the partial pressure gradient. That's the concentration gradient. The second, and this really explains why the exchange of oxygen and CO2 are about the same rate, is because it also is determined by the solubility of gas in the liquid. So if both CO2 and oxygen had the same solubility in that thin layer of water lining the alveoli, then the rate of diffusion would be the same for both molecules. But as it turns out, CO2 is much, much more soluble in water than oxygen. Oxygen has kind of a hard time diffusing in water. So you need a larger gradient in order to transport oxygen at the same rate as you do for CO2 in the opposite direction. Okay? So yes, there is a larger concentration gradient for oxygen, but because oxygen isn't as soluble in water, it is transported about the same rate as CO2. Okay. So the same factors that are involved in external respiration are also involved in internal respiration. So this shows the concentration of gases in the systemic capillaries and the concentration of the respiratory gases in the tissues. So in the tissues, the concentration of oxygen is very low because the cells have used up most of the oxygen for cellular respiration or oxidative phosphorylation. So the partial pressure of oxygen in tissues is only about 40. That's about as low as it's going to get. The concentration of oxygen in the systemic capillaries, though, is about 95 millimeters mercury. It's not high. It's not as high as the concentration of oxygen in the alveoli because gas exchange isn't perfect. Okay, but since the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the systemic capillaries than the tissues, that means that once that blood gets to our cells, oxygen is going to diffuse from the systemic capillaries into the cells of our tissues. Okay, and so it's going to move to the right on this table. Now, CO2 is actually going to be higher in the tissues than in the blood because the cells of the tissues are constantly producing CO2. The partial pressure of CO2 in the blood is about 40 millimeters because it's being CO2 is constantly eliminated in the lungs. So since concentration is higher in the tissues than in the systemic capillaries, then CO2 is going to move in the opposite direction compared to oxygen. Okay? So again, gases just move from one area to another, mainly just based on the concentration difference or the difference in partial pressures between two areas. Now, there are some other factors, though, that can affect gas exchange. One of them is the total air pressure. Now, if you go from sea level, where the air pressure is 760 millimeters mercury, up to a very high altitude, let's say you go up to the top of one of the 14ers in Colorado, that's what they call their highest peaks in Colorado. Air pressure at 14,500 feet is only about 440 millimeters mercury. Okay. And since the total air pressure is less, when you multiply the partial pressure to that lower air pressure, you're going to get a lower partial pressure of oxygen. Since the partial pressure of oxygen is lower at this altitude, then you're not going to have as much concentration gradient for oxygen between the oxygen in your lungs and the pulmonary capillaries. And that partial pressure of oxygen is lowered so much that it's not going to be enough to completely saturate the blood in your lungs at that altitude. And so if you go from sea level up to that high altitude, you're going to feel like you can't get enough air. You're going to be breathing really hard because the partial pressure of oxygen is so low in the atmosphere. Okay. And then kind of opposite of that is if you look at the partial pressure of gases in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. Hyperbaric oxygen chambers are sometimes used to treat people that have wounds that are infected. And so it's a chamber that has a really high pressure. With that higher pressure, you have a higher partial pressure of oxygen. And so it oxygenates your tissues a lot better. Sometimes that inhibits the growth of bacteria, and it speeds up healing. So if you go into a hyperbaric oxygen chamber that has a pressure of 3 to 4 atmospheres, the partial pressure of oxygen is going to be anywhere from 2,300 to 3,000 millimeters mercury instead of 760 millimeters mercury. So that's going to greatly increase the concentration gradient, which greatly increases the diffusion of oxygen into the blood. Now, another factor that can affect gas exchange is the thickness of the respiratory membrane. The distance that a molecule has to diffuse is another factor that affects the rate of diffusion. And the respiratory membrane between the blood and the alveolar air is only about a half a micron thick. That's a really, really short distance. And so gas molecules can diffuse through the membrane very quickly. It's much, much less than the thickness of a single red blood cell. However, in congestive heart failure, blood backs up into the lungs and the alveoli start becoming filled with fluid. And when that happens, then the oxygen molecules have to travel through more fluid. So it effectively increases the distance the oxygen has to travel. So that's going to greatly slow down the diffusion of oxygen. And so that's going to make it hard for a person with congestive heart failure to get enough oxygen. So what would you want to do with somebody like that that's not getting enough oxygen? How would you treat them if they had congestive heart failure? I mean, the immediate treatment in order to get their blood saturated properly with oxygen. What would you want to do? Well, what do you do if someone's not getting enough oxygen? They're short of breath. If someone's suffocating, what do? Give them more oxygen, right? So you put an oxygen mask on them from an oxygen tank. Okay, so that's what you would want to do. Now there are treatments for congestive heart failure. The most common one is to give them a drug that causes them to increase their water excretion, produce more urine, and that reduces their blood volume, and that prevents water from backing up in their lungs if you lower their blood pressure, okay, by lowering their blood volume. So that will also help too in the long run. But immediately, if they're not getting enough oxygen, you need to put them on an oxygen mask. Another factor that affects gas exchange is the area of the respiratory surfaces, or the membrane area. Healthy lung has a total surface area of about 70 square meters, or I think they've changed this. They used to say volleyball court, now they're saying handball court. I forgot to change it on the slide. So some diseases actually cause the breakdown of the alveoli, and the alveoli get replaced with scar tissue, which actually reduces the surface area available for gas exchange. And so some of those conditions include emphysema, lung cancer, and tuberculosis that can cause fibrosis of the lungs, and that reduces the surface area available for gas exchange. So someone with one of these conditions might also have a hard time getting enough oxygen in their body. Now another mechanism that relates to gas exchange, and this is not really a problem, it's just sort of a mechanism that occurs. There's a process in our body that occurs called ventilation perfusion coupling. And this refers to the matching of airflow to blood flow, okay? Now, your lungs actually have mechanisms that regulate the amount of airflow relative to blood flow and vice versa. So, if you have a part of the lung that's not getting much airflow because of maybe an obstruction or something, blood flow will automatically be reduced to that area, because it doesn't do any good to have a real high airflow to a part of the lung if you don't have much blood flow. It's not gonna do much good. So instead what happens is blood flow to that part of the lung is reduced, and that blood is diverted to another part of the lung that has more airflow. Okay? The opposite of that is if you have a reduced blood flow to a part of the lung, so it's less than the amount of airflow, then airflow gets reduced. What happens is you'll get vasoconstriction of the, or you'll get bronchoconstriction of the bronchioles to reduce the airflow to match the blood flow. If blood flow is higher than it should be to a part of the lungs, then you have increased, then you have bronchodilation, which increases the airflow to match the blood flow. Okay? Because it doesn't do any good to have lots of airflow to a part of the lung if you don't have enough blood to pick up the oxygen from that air. Okay? So there's mechanisms that control the amount of airflow and blood flow to different parts of the lungs. All right, let's do another question. This question says, the partial pressure of which of the following is the lowest? And I think you can assume that this is referring to the air, but it could refer to the body as well, because it's the same in the body as it is in the air. What's interesting is that the gas that is in the highest proportion of the air is nitrogen. Air is about 78% nitrogen, so over 3/4 of all air molecules is nitrogen. However, that nitrogen in the air is largely unavailable to animals. Animals cannot absorb nitrogen and incorporate it into their body. They have to get nitrogen from other sources. About the only organisms that can take nitrogen out of the air and incorporate it into their bodies are microorganisms. There are some algae and some bacteria that can convert nitrogen gas into other forms that they can use, like nitrates and nitrites. So some of you, if you've taken microbiology, you might have learned about that, or you might learn about it later in this lesson. So let's take a look at your responses. Oh, this was the lowest, not the highest. Okay, I was thinking of the highest one. Okay, so that's correct. Carbon dioxide is the lowest. Air only contains about 0.04%. It used to be, when I first started teaching this class, which is a long time ago, they said that concentration of air in the atmosphere is only a little over 0.03%. Now it's over 0.04%. So it's actually gone up almost 25% in just a few decades. So, okay. Then the next part of chapter 22 is concerned with gas transport in the blood. Okay, so different mechanisms transport oxygen compared to CO2. So I think I'll just, we have about 8 minutes left, so I think I'll just introduce you to this topic. I guess let's start out with another question. Which of the following is a factor affecting the rate of gas exchange? Should be able to answer this one pretty quickly, since we just went over this. Okay, so as I guessed, most of you said all the above, and that's correct. All those are factors. Okay. So, gas transport refers to the movement of gases through the bloodstream from the lungs to the tissues and vice versa. Both carbon dioxide and oxygen are transported by the blood. Transport occurs both in the plasma as well as the red blood cells. But the red blood cells play an important role in transport of both gases. Actually, the vast majority of oxygen is transported in the red blood cells. The biggest proportion of CO2 is actually transported in the plasma. But the red blood cells do play a role in that process, as we'll see. We probably won't get into the mechanism today, but we will later. So let's just take a look at transport of oxygen. This is the easiest mechanism to describe. There are two main ways that oxygen is transported by the blood. The first is that a very small percentage, only about 1.5% of the oxygen that is taken into our blood is transported just by dissolving directly into the plasma. Okay, that's a very low percentage because oxygen is not very soluble in water. Most of our plasma is made up of water. So all the rest, which is 98.5%, is transported by binding to the iron-containing heme group that's part of hemoglobin. Okay? We talked about hemoglobin a little bit at the very beginning of the semester when we were looking at blood. Hemoglobin is a very large protein that contains 4 subunits, or 4 globins. Those subunits are called globins. Each globin has an iron-containing heme group. This is what the heme group looks like. And so when hemoglobin transports oxygen, the oxygen binds to this iron molecule, or this iron atom in the middle of the heme group. And since there are 4 heme groups in hemoglobin, each hemoglobin molecule can transport a maximum of 4 oxygen molecules. Okay, so that's what transports the vast majority of oxygen. Okay, transport of carbon dioxide is a lot more complex because there are 3 different mechanisms by which CO2 is transported. Okay, again, a small proportion of CO2 is transported just by dissolving into plasma. But there are 2 other mechanisms that are involved, and one of them involves a fairly complex chemical reaction. And since we only have a few minutes left today, we don't really have time to get into that. So I think this is a good place for us to stop. So let's stop here. When we come back, we'll take a look at how CO2 is transported.